Hello and welcome to a fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about the legacy of Al Jolson. Now, in the first half of the 20th century, Al Jolson was the king, and specifically in the 1920s and 1930s, in terms of being a pop entertainment all-around superstar of the world, there was no one bigger than Al Jolson. He was everywhere selling records like no one had sold records before. The record industry was in its early decades, but a lot of the maturity in that industry came off of the sales of records by Al Jolson. You could see him all over Broadway on stage. He was the king of film and even starred in the first ever talking picture, the first film that ever had a sound accompaniment, and that was 1927's The Jazz Singer. So you can sort of see by all of those sort of milestones just how big he was. And his style really helped define the era. He was a classic vaudevillian who sort of brought the 19th century into the 20th century before his popularity somewhat fell victim to trends that were explicitly born in the 20th century, as opposed to a style from the previous century that Al Jolson brought into his own. If that makes any sense, let's hope it does. In terms of his singing, it was very different than the classic pop of the mid 20th century. The classic pop of the mid 20th century, very jazz influenced in many ways. One of its hallmarks is crooning, where the vocals can be very dynamic, from very intimate to something that then escalates with the crescendo. Where Al Jolson came from an era where singing of popular music was much more derived from sort of light opera than anything else. Think big, loud projection. Think of very melodramatic vibrato. Think of, instead of using dynamics, soft and loud, to influence the emotional delivery of the singing, there would be things like different kinds of vibrato, different kinds of intonation, different voices you would use, funny accents that you would employ, because this was an era, much like opera was and remains, where there were no microphones. Now, obviously, by the 1920s, there were, but even then, the electronic microphone was more readily found in music studios, either for radio or for recording. Live venues at the time didn't have PAs on the whole. They were starting to come about, but especially the singers who came from the pre-electronic microphone era, which anyone who was famous before the 1920s did, it was expected that, like an opera singer, you in the world of vaudeville and the pop which grew out of it, you were expected to be able to fill an entire auditorium with your voice. And albeit the auditoriums before the mid-20th century tended to be intentionally more reverberant, when we get into amplified sound, acousticians are looking to dampen the sound, whereas concert halls and theaters that are meant for sound that is not amplified, those halls are designed for sonic reverberance. And so that was another difference between the era of Al Jolson and the era that came after. Sorry there, folks. The battery died, so I'm going to have to glue these two together. Where was I? I think I was talking about the second sort of half of his career. Apologies if I've already said this, but anyway, in the second half of his career, which was really the late 30s and 1940s, he remained very popular, even though the era of the new singers who were accustomed to the microphone, to radio, to records, they were coming up with a very different style. And the next big superstar to arise was Bing Crosby, whose much more intimate style, as though he was singing right there for you in a small room as opposed to in a grand theater. That became the more prominent vocal style. But he remained incredibly popular. He entertained the troops both in the Second World War and in Korea, and it was returning home from Korea that he died in the year 1950. He was in his early 60s, a long and fruitful career. Now, his career wasn't free of controversy because he was the most popular entertainer, full stop, but he was also the most popular entertainer to perform in blackface. And this continues to divide contemporary audiences about Jolson to this day. The arguments against is that it was at its fundamental level a form of cultural appropriation, and that beyond that, it was a form of stereotyping and bigotry of black artists who weren't able to have the access to various venues that non-black artists had. And that case against him was made mainly after his death. There were, of course, many people who, throughout the era after his death, including up to this day, will defend his use of blackface while still condemning it in other contexts. Some will say that in his day, it was just a standard form of performance for many non-black entertainers, and that was true. Whether it was right or wrong is a different question, but that part insofar as it is a fact of history, there it stands. Another argument for that, if you want to call it that, is that he had very close relations with many black artists of his day and even did a lot to include them in his act. Others would say that it was a form of sympathizing with black artists. So I don't know if people will ever agree on that. In fact, they won't. There are some things on which people just won't agree, and that's okay, because that's what makes videos like these interesting. If everyone agreed, no one would need to talk about anything. So a man who was incredibly popular, someone who was very much a an emblem of a certain style, both his vocal style, his vaudevillian style, and indeed the controversial blackface style of his day. But whether you love him or not, he was the man who, in the 1920s, that all-important era when the record industry started to come of age, he was the world's most popular entertainer. So there's your blast from the 1920s past. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.